221,000 apartments. That is what the city government of Vienna owns. Not subsidizes, owns. And it has never sold them. Now, two facts that should not fit beside it. Austrian house prices, inflation stripped out, are more than 50% above the year 2000. And rent in Vienna eats less of a salary than in almost any comparable European capital. Same boom as everywhere. Cheaper in any way. Those numbers do not fit together. And the missing piece is a tax that stopped existing 90 years ago. About 500,000 people live in those apartments, roughly a quarter of a city. And the landlord on every single one of those leases is the municipality itself. Austria is richer per head than Britain. This is not a poor city being careful. It is a rich city that owns the ground everybody else is bidding on. In the private market in Vienna, a square meter of rented floor costs between 12 and 22 euros a month. In a city-owned building, the same square meter runs between 5 and 9. That gap is not a discount the city hands out each year. Nobody writes a check for it. The gap exists because the buildings were paid for a long time ago by someone who is dead, with money that was taken in a way no city has managed to repeat since. So there are two questions in this video, and they're different questions. The first is how. How does a city with no money, in a country that had just lost an empire and a war, build 65,000 apartments in 11 years and finish without a single loan against them? That one has an answer, and it is a good one. The second question is why. Every city in Europe watched Vienna do this. The blueprints were published. The buildings are still standing, and you can walk into the courtyards this afternoon, and not one of them copied it. By the end of this video, you will know exactly how it was done and why the thing that made it possible cannot be assembled again. To understand the money, you have to start with a decree nobody remembers, signed by an emperor who was about to lose his throne. 26th of January, 1917. Vienna is a city at war. Men are at the front, their families are in rented rooms, and landlords are raising rents on soldiers' wives. So the imperial government freezes rents. It is a wartime measure. It is supposed to expire at the end of 1918. Then the war ends, the empire dissolves, and the currency does what currencies do after a lost war. The crown collapses. By 1922, it is worth roughly 1/14,000th of what it was. And the frozen rent is frozen in crowns. Here is what that does. Before the war, a working-class household in Vienna spent about 15% of everything it had on rent. By 1925, that number is 2 to 3%. Not reduced, erased. A landlord in Vienna is now collecting an amount of money that will not repair the roof. And so the private housing industry of a European capital simply stops. Nobody builds. Nobody renovates. Nobody buys a building to rent out because rental income has become a rounding error, which means land inside the city is suddenly historically cheap. And there's exactly one buyer left in Vienna with the size to take it, the city. But there's a detail in the way. A city cannot levy a tax. Only a state can. The man who solves that problem is not a housing reformer. He's a banker. Hugo Breitner spends 30 years at the Anglo-Austrian Bank and retires as a director. He knows exactly how rich people in Vienna hold their money, because for 3 decades his job was to hold it for them. In 1919, he takes the job of city finance counselor, and he takes it in a city that is bankrupt, hungry, and full of people living in rooms with no window. Picture him at that desk. The city has an obligation it cannot pay for and no legal instrument to raise money with. A federal government hostile to everything Vienna's council stands for. And a wave of tenants who have just discovered that their rent in real terms is close to nothing, which is a relief for them and a catastrophe for anyone hoping the private market will build the next apartment. Breitner's insight is not about buildings. It is about jurisdiction. If Vienna were a state, and not merely a city inside a state, it could write its own tax law. On the 1st of January, 1922, that is precisely what happens. Now watch how each solution creates the next problem. Problem 1. no power to tax. Solved on the 1st of January 1922, when Vienna is separate from Lower Austria and becomes a federal state with the right to invent its own taxes. Problem 2. What do you tax in a city with no money? On the 20th of January 1923, the council passes the housing construction tax. It takes effect 11 days later, and it is built on a beautiful piece of arithmetic. The tax is charged on rent, but not on the rent anyone is actually paying. It is charged on the 1914 Gold Crown rent, the pre-war value of the apartment, which nobody has collected in years, but which is still written in the register. And it is steeply progressive. A small worker's flat pays about 2%. A grand apartment on the ring pays up to 37% of its old rental value. The result is a tax that almost nobody feels and a handful of people feel enormously. The most expensive half of 1% of Vienna's tax properties produce 45% of the revenue. Problem 3. The people paying it can leave. This is the argument every finance minister since has lost. Tax the rich hard enough, and they move. In Vienna, they largely cannot, because what is being taxed is not their income. Is their building? A building does not emigrate. Problem 4. The city could borrow against the future revenue and build faster. Breitner refuses. From 1923 onward, the program runs on cash, collected this year, spent this year, is slower, is also the reason there is no creditor standing over the city when politics turns. And problem 5 is the one he cannot solve because it is not financial. Every apartment block that goes up is a permanent 4-story argument for the party that built it. Imagine you are living through this. It is 1926, and you are a tram conductor in Vienna. You have a wife, 3 children, and 1 room with a shared water tap in the corridor. That is the standard, not the tragedy. Roughly 92% of Viennese apartments before the war had no toilet inside them. Then your name comes up on a list, and you are handed keys to something the city has just finished. 2 rooms, your own tap, your own toilet, a window that opens onto a courtyard with grass in it, a laundry, a kindergarten, and a doctor's office. Here is the part that matters economically. Your rent in that new building is not set by what the apartment is worth. It is set to cover running costs and repairs, because the construction was already paid for in cash by a tax on a rich man's building in another district. There is no mortgage inside your rent. There is no investor inside your rent. There is no land price inside your rent, because the city bought the land when land was worthless. Strip those 3 things out of any rent anywhere in the world in any year, and what is left is small. That is the entire trick, not generosity. Subtraction. So how much money are we actually talking about? The housing construction tax brings in 37.9 million shillings in 1925, 36.3 million in 1930. It peaks at 50.8 million in 1933. Against the total cost of building, it covers somewhere between 1/3 and 40%. The rest comes from a separate luxury tax and from federal funds. And on that money, between 1923 and 1934, Vienna builds around 65,000 apartments. The showpiece is the Karl-Marx-Hof. Architect Karl N., a student of Otto Wagner, built between 1927 and 1930. It runs more than a kilometer along a single street, long enough that 4 tram stops fit against its facade, and it holds over 1,300 apartments. It is worth being precise about what it was designed to be. Only about a quarter of the site is building. The rest is courtyard, gardens, laundries, baths, clinics, a library. This is the second part of the machine that people miss when they only look at the rent. The city was not buying shelter. It was buying the things a low wage could not otherwise reach. Now, the obvious objection. Fine, but that is a story from the 1920s. Prices today are set by today's market. So look at what the market actually did. In Austria, real house prices, inflation stripped out, sat about 79 in the year 2000 on an index where 2015 is 100. By 2020, they had climbed to 125. That is a rise of roughly 56% in real terms in 20 years. The Austrian housing market boomed exactly like everybody else's. Vienna did not escape the market. It just kept a fifth of its population off it. Somebody was always going to notice. What the housing tax did, in effect, was move money from one class of Viennese to another without asking the first class for its consent, and it did so out in the open, with the results carved in stone above the doorways. Property owners called it confiscation. The federal government, run by the Christian Social Party, watched a socialist city administration build a physical monument to its own competence every few months and understood precisely what that meant for the next election. And the buildings themselves did not help. They have towers. They have flags. They have their names cut into the facade in meter-high letters. Karl-Marx-Hof, Remotion, PAYOFF. An apartment block is not usually a political statement. These were designed to be one, and everybody involved knew it. Two things then happen at once. Austria's economy falls into the Great Depression, which cuts the tax base under the whole program. And Austrian democracy stops working. In March 1933, the Chancellor, Engelbert Dollfuss, uses a procedural collapse in Parliament to stop Parliament meeting at all and governs by emergency decree instead. The Socialist Party's paramilitary wing is banned. Weapons are hidden. Everyone can see where this is going, including the people living in the buildings. 12th of February, 1934. Police moved to search a Social Democratic Party building in Linz for weapons. This time a local militia does not hand them over. It shoots. Within hours, the fighting is in Vienna, and the government does something that had not been done to a residential building in a European capital in peacetime. On the 13th of February, from the high ground at Hohe Wart, the Federal Army opens artillery fire on the Karl-Marx-Hof. Field howitzers are used against the Goethehof the following day. These are apartment blocks. There are families inside them. The fighting lasts 4 days. The best modern estimate from the historian Kurt Bauer's 2018 study puts the dead at around 350 to 370, roughly a third civilians, a third government forces, a third fighters, with 9 men executed afterwards. Contemporary figures were disputed at the time and are still disputed now. The Social Democratic Party is banned, and Vienna loses the thing the entire program was built on. The city's status as a federal state is suspended, and with it the right to levy its own tax. The housing construction tax dies, not from an argument about whether it worked. It is worth being exact here, because this is the pivot of the whole story. The tax was not repealed by voters who decided it had failed. It was ended by artillery. 11 years, 65,000 apartments, and then it stops in 4 days. Walk up to the Karl-Marx-Hof today. There is a tram stop directly outside, and the building runs on past it and past the next one. The facade is a strong ochre red. There are prams in the courtyard and washing on the balconies. Over 1,300 apartments, still rented, still owned by the city, 92 years after the shells came in from the hill above. And here is the reversal. The tax that built it is gone. The party that built it was banned, then the country was annexed, then bombed, then occupied for a decade. Every political condition that produced these buildings was destroyed. The buildings were not. That is the whole asset. A tax is a flow. It could be repealed on a Tuesday afternoon. A building is a stock, and a stock has to be either destroyed or sold before it stops paying out. Vienna's stock was shelled, and it survived. And then, this is the part that decides the modern story. The city never sold it. Not in the 1980s, when the fashionable move across Europe was to sell public housing to its tenants. Not in the 90s, when city budgets were tight everywhere. 221,000 apartments, held for a century through fascism, war, occupation, and 4 currencies. The single most consequential thing Vienna has done about housing in the last 50 years is nothing. It refused to sell. Now the uncomfortable part, because a system this old has a bill and somebody is paying it. Start with the number Vienna itself likes to quote. More than 60% of Viennese live in municipal or subsidized housing. That figure is true, and it is also doing some work. The city's own research body puts the share of the stock carrying a permanent social binding at closer to 40 to 45%. The rest are apartments whose subsidy conditions have expired. So the honest number is not 60. It is somewhere in the 40s, plus a large group of people living in flats that used to be bound and no longer are. Second, there is a door, and it has a lock on it. To get on the list for a city apartment, you need 2 continuous years of registered residence in Vienna, and you need Austrian, EU, or equivalent long-term status. If you arrived in Vienna last year from outside the Union, you're not on a waiting list. You're not in the system at all. You are in the private market, paying 14 to 1,600 euros a month for a 2-bedroom, next to a neighbor who pays a third of that. Third, and this is the sharpest one, it is measured by Austria's own statistics office. Rental contracts less than 2 years old cost between 12 and 13.5 euros per square meter. Contracts 30 years or older cost about 6.5. Same city, same law, roughly double the price. And the only variable is when you arrived. A system that protects people who are already inside it will, given enough decades, become a system that is mostly about who was early. And fourth, Vienna stopped. After the 1st of May, 2004, the city did not build a single new municipal apartment for 11 years. It subsidized non-profit builders instead. The mayor announced the restart in 2015. The first new building was handed to tenants in November 2019. About 5,700 new units have followed, against 221,000. That is the inheritance doing the work, not the current program. So the 2 questions: how do they pay for it? A tax on the pre-war paper value of rich men's buildings, levied by a city that had just made itself a state, collected and spent in the same year, so that no bank ever held a claim on a single brick. And why has nobody repeated it? Because that answer needs all of it at once. You need a currency collapse that has already wiped out private landlords, so the land is cheap and nobody is bidding against you. You need constitutional powers most cities do not have. You need a governing party willing to be hated by the wealthiest 0.5% of its own city. And you need to hold the result for 100 years without selling it, through the exact century in which almost every other government in Europe found a reason to sell. Vienna did not solve the housing market. Look at the chart again. Austrian house prices rose 56% in real terms in 20 years, the same boom as everywhere. What Vienna did was carry a 100-year-old inheritance across that boom without spending it, so that 1/5 of its people are standing outside the auction while it happens. That is why rent there takes about 38% of a single salary, while Dublin takes over 60%. Not better policy today. Better property bought a century ago and never sold. Which leaves the question that actually applies to where you live, because your city almost certainly owned land once too. It sold it for a budget gap or a stadium or a one-off surplus that got spent in a single year. So here is the real one. Is a city government even capable of holding an asset for 100 years when every election is for?